Snow drifted sideways across the platform, a curtain of white that softened the hard edges of the world and hushed the few sounds that dared to rise above the cold. The train station was little more than a drafty wooden room, with a frost-stitched ticket window, and a wind-battered sign swinging on its chain. The boards beneath the overhang groaned under the weight of ice, and in that muffled stillness, 3 figures stood apart from the warmth of any hearth. Eileen May Bennett pulled her shawl tighter around her daughter, the coarse wool no match for the slicing wind. Lila's small boots, thin and scuffed, shifted from foot to foot in the snow, leaving shallow prints that the wind began to erase as soon as they were made. Eileen's dark hair, once soft and carefully tended, was tangled now, strands snapping against her cheek in the gusts. Her dress, faded blue, clung damp at the hem, and though her jaw was set, there was a hollowness to her eyes that even the cold could not explain. She kept her gaze on the empty tracks, as though by sheer will she could summon someone from the distance, a figure she knew in her bones would not come. The last stage had gone hours ago. The telegraph clerk, after a brief, pitying glance, had retreated inside, the door shutting with the finality of indifference. The station platform was theirs alone. Eileen did not yet know how long she would keep standing there, nor where she would go when her legs gave out. It was Lila who saw him first. From the blur of white came the shape of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, bare to the waist despite the punishing wind. Steam lifted from his skin where snowflakes landed and died, as though the heat in him refused to yield to the storm. His hair, black and straight, hung loose past his shoulders. His face, carved in lines of quiet severity, was turned toward the station, his eyes fixed not on the mother or the child but somewhere beyond, as though he'd walked this road too many times to be surprised by what lay in front of him. Dakota Greyhawk reached the platform with the measured gait of a man who wasted no movement. The rifle slung across his back glinted dull under the low winter light. He stepped up onto the boards without a glance toward the frost-laced window or the empty bench, his bare chest rising slow with each breath. Lila's mittened hand tugged at her mother's skirt. Eileen leaned down, thinking she would whisper about the cold or her hunger, but the little girl's eyes were wide in a way that made Eileen hesitate. "Can you pretend to be my daddy?" Lila said, her voice high and unshaken against the wind. "Just for one day?" Eileen's breath caught, the question hitting her like a stone dropped in still water. She turned sharply toward her daughter, ready to hush her, to say, "Don't bother him, don't talk like that," but the words tangled in her throat. Dakota had stopped. The snow swirled between them, catching in the strands of his hair, dusting the curve of his shoulders. He looked down at the child, then at Eileen, his gaze holding neither pity nor surprise. The door behind them creaked open. Mrs. Edna Whitlow, the station's matron, peered out, cheeks red from the stove inside. Her eyes darted from Eileen to the towering Apache, to the little girl between them. "Mercy!" she murmured, not kindly, before retreating into the warmth, the door closing like the snap of a jaw. The weight of the air shifted. Eileen straightened, shame prickling her skin hotter than the cold. She wanted to tell this man that Lila didn't understand what she was asking, that they didn't need anything from him, that they were fine. But her lips refused the lie. Dakota stepped closer. The snow creaked under his boots. He crouched, bringing himself to the child's height, and for a long moment said nothing. Lila didn't fidget. She only looked at him, as if she'd been waiting for him her whole life. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, even, carrying in the cold like a low drumbeat. "One day." It was not a promise, not quite. But it was not a refusal. He straightened and extended his hand toward Eileen, the gesture as quiet as it was commanding. His palm was broad, fingers scarred from work and weather. Eileen hesitated, the memory of other men's hands pressing against her in moments when she'd had no choice flickering in her mind. But this was different. There was no pull in his touch, no demand in his stance. He simply waited. The wind cut between them, sharp enough to make her eyes water. She placed her hand in his, the heat of his skin startling against the chill. Without a word, he turned from the platform, leading them toward the road that wound into the white distance. The snow deepened with each step away from the station. Eileen glanced back once, watching their prints fill and vanish. It struck her then, how easily the world could forget they had ever been there. They walked in silence, Lila perched on Dakota's hip as though she'd always belonged there. Eileen noticed how he adjusted his hold every few steps, keeping the child's face sheltered from the wind. His bare chest didn't flinch against the cold. It was as if he carried his own season with him, untouched by winter's bite. The road narrowed between stands of pine, their branches sagging under snow. Somewhere far off, a crow called, its cry sharp against the muffled quiet. Eileen could feel the heat of Dakota's body beside her, the slow rhythm of his stride, the unhurried certainty of his pace. It steadied something in her she hadn't realized was shaking. By the time the pines thinned and the shape of a cabin emerged from the white, the sky had begun to dim. The structure was plain, smoke curling from the stone chimney, the snow around it trampled by a single set of tracks. Dakota set Lila down and unlatched the door, holding it open without looking back. The smell of wood smoke and something savory drifted out, curling into Eileen's lungs like a memory she had never lived. She stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around her legs like a quilt. Lila, fearless, wandered toward the hearth, hands outstretched to the blaze. Dakota closed the door against the wind, the soft thud sealing them into a space where the outside world no longer mattered. Eileen stood near the threshold, unsure whether to sit, to speak, to leave. She could still hear the voice of Mrs. Whitlow in her mind, feel the imagined eyes of the town on her back. But when she looked at Lila, pink-cheeked and grinning by the fire, the knot in her chest loosened just a little. Dakota crossed the room, removed the rifle from his back, and set it in the corner. His movements were without urgency, each one as deliberate as a man laying stones in a river. He glanced once toward her, then to Lila, and then began ladling stew from a pot hanging over the flames. Eileen wanted to say something, ask why, or for how long, but the words felt unnecessary in the quiet he carried. Snow whispered against the roof. The fire popped softly. And for the first time in a long while, Eileen realized she wasn't thinking about where she would go next. Outside, the last light bled into the snow, and the tracks they had made from the station were already gone. The cabin was warmer than Eileen expected, though the walls were thin enough for the wind to slip its cold fingers through the seams. She stood near the door, her shawl still clutched around her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke and simmering meat thick in the air. The firelight painted the rough-hewn walls gold and red, shadows shifting like living things in the corners. Dakota moved with a quiet certainty, his bare feet soundless against the plank floor. He ladled stew into 3 mismatched bowls, setting them on the small table by the hearth without ceremony. Eileen noticed how he placed the largest portion in front of her, the smallest before himself, and how he didn't look up to see whether she had noticed. Lila clambered onto the bench, her cheeks bright from the warmth, and began to eat without hesitation. Eileen sat slowly, the bench creaking under her. Her first spoonful was careful, as though the food might be taken away. The broth was thick, heavy with potatoes and venison, and the heat of it seemed to spread through her chest before it reached her stomach. She kept her eyes on the bowl, aware of him across the table. His hands, broad and scarred, worked steadily at tearing bread into small pieces, passing half to Lila, and placing the rest within her reach. For a long while, the only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the faint hiss of the fire. The storm outside thickened, snow tapping against the shutters like fingers seeking entry. When the bowls were empty, Dakota stood, gathering them up. Eileen started to rise, but his glance, steady and brief, held her in place. He washed the dishes in a basin by the wall, pouring hot water from a kettle, the scent of lye soap rising with the steam. Lila, full and sleepy, curled herself near the fire on a folded blanket. Eileen watched as Dakota pulled another blanket from a shelf and draped it over the child with a care that felt out of place for a man she'd met barely an hour ago. He crouched for a moment, adjusting the edges so no draft could reach her. "You didn't have to bring us here," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of suspicion she hadn't intended. He straightened. Snow was coming. "That doesn't mean—" She stopped herself, unsure what she'd meant to accuse him of. Gratitude and caution tangled in her chest. Dakota crossed to the hearth, adding a split log to the flames. Sparks flared, lighting the planes of his face for an instant, before fading back into the orange glow. "You have nowhere to be," he said, not as a question. Eileen's fingers twisted in the fringe of her shawl. I had somewhere once. The statement seemed to sit between them, unpushed, unprobed. He did not ask who had left her, or why she was standing at that station with a child and no bags. She wondered if he already knew, if in towns like these, stories like hers traveled faster than the wind. A faint knock at the door broke the stillness. Dakota opened it to find a neighbor, a pale man on horseback, who leaned to peer inside. His gaze slid over Eileen, lingered on Lila asleep by the fire, and then fixed on Dakota's bare chest. "Storm's bad," the man said. "Best keep to yourself." His tone carried the weight of something unsaid. Dakota nodded once and shut the door. Eileen's stomach knotted. "They'll talk," she murmured. "They talk already," he replied, settling onto the bench opposite her. "Talk is lighter than hunger." She didn't know what to make of that, but some part of her recognized it as truth. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed. After a while, she rose to unlace Lila's damp boots, setting them near the hearth to dry. Her own shoes were sodden, the leather stiff. Without a word, Dakota took them, kneeling to place them closer to the flames. Eileen stood awkwardly, unsure if she should thank him or remain silent. He seemed to expect neither. Her fingers brushed the gloves she wore, stiff, worn thin at the palms. She remembered the last man who'd held them in his hands, the way he pressed them back into her grip when he told her she wasn't the kind of woman a man married. The gloves had kept her hands warm all winter, but the memory had never thawed. The night deepened. Dakota checked the shutters, then returned to the table. "You and the child will sleep in the bed," he said simply. "And you?" "Here." He nodded toward a rug rolled near the hearth. She hesitated, caught between refusing and accepting. "We'll leave in the morning." His eyes met hers, unreadable. Morning is far off. It was not the kind of answer meant to argue with, so she let it stand. Lila stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that made Eileen's throat tighten. She bent to lift her daughter, feeling the small weight settle against her shoulder, and carried her toward the bed in the corner. The quilt was heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. She laid Lila down, smoothing the hair from her forehead, and for a moment forgot there was anyone else in the room. When she turned, Dakota was at the table, carving a small piece of wood with a narrow knife. His movements were slow, the shavings falling like curled petals to the floor. Eileen lingered at the edge of the firelight, watching the shape emerge, a bird, delicate and spare. He set the carving on the table, and pushed it toward her without looking up. "For the child." She stepped forward, her fingers brushing the smooth grain. "You made this now?" "Not everything needs time," he said, eyes on the fire. Eileen didn't know whether to smile or frown. She left the carving where it lay, feeling its presence as though it were still in her hands. The wind roared against the walls, and the snow beat steady on the roof. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, but the space between them was something neither seemed eager to close. She returned to the bed, slipping beneath the quilt beside her daughter, listening to the soft scrape of his knife as he worked on another piece. The fire's glow spilled across the room, fading into shadow near the door. She thought of the station platform, the emptiness of the tracks, and the way the snow had already swallowed the path they'd taken here. For the first time in months, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like a weight pressing her into the ground. Her eyes drifted shut to the sound of the wind, and the faint, steady rhythm of Dakota's knife. The storm broke by dawn, leaving the world wrapped in white so bright it made Eileen's eyes ache. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney into a sky rinsed pale by the cold. Inside, the fire had burned low, but Dakota was already on his feet, pulling on his boots with the quiet efficiency of a man who greeted the day without waste. Lila was still asleep, one small hand resting on the carved bird, the quilt pulled up to her chin. Eileen lingered at the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the frayed gloves in her lap. She had slept more deeply than she expected, though the memory of strange walls had kept her mind half waking through the night. "We'll go into town," Dakota said, fastening the strap of his rifle. "You need things." Eileen hesitated. It might be better if... He didn't turn, but his voice was steady. "You need things." The walk was long but clean after the storm, the snow crusted in places, soft in others. Takota's stride was unhurried, his breath visible in slow clouds. Eileen walked beside him, her boots leaving narrow prints alongside his deep ones. Lila, bundled in an oversized coat Takota had found in a trunk, clutched his hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When the town came into view, Eileen felt her shoulders tighten. The buildings huddled together against the wind, their windows rimmed with frost. A few figures moved along the boardwalks, their heads turning as the three of them stepped onto the main street. At the general store, the bell above the door announced their arrival too loudly. Jonas Pierce, the owner, looked up from behind the counter. His gaze passed over Eileen, lingered on Lila, and finally settled on Takota, with something that was not quite welcome. "Morning," Takota said. Jonas's reply was thin. "Storm treat you all right?" Takota's nod was slight. Eileen busied herself at the shelves, gathering flour, lard, a tin of coffee. She could feel the eyes from the corner. Two older women by the bolts of cloth, their whispers just loud enough to be heard. "Seen her before, haven't you?" "That Bennett girl. Thought she'd gone east." "Living out at Greyhawk's place, is she?" The words slid under her skin like icy water. She kept her gaze low, stacking the tin and the sack of flour in her arms. Lila was at the counter, swinging her legs against the wood, oblivious to the current of disapproval in the room. Takota took the flour from her arms without a word, setting it on the counter. His hands moved steadily, counting coins, arranging the goods in a sack. He didn't look toward the women, didn't answer the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. When they stepped back outside, the light seemed harsher. Eileen followed him to the stable, where he checked the horse he kept in town. Lila busied herself feeding the mare a piece of apple from her pocket. "You heard them," Eileen said quietly. He tightened the cinch on the saddle. "Talk is air. It disappears if you don't chase it." "That's easy for you to say." "They're not." She stopped herself, unsure what she'd been about to confess. He turned then, his eyes steady. "It's not easy. I just choose." The words lodged in her chest. She realized she was standing closer to him than she had at the station, the heat of his nearness cutting the cold. The walk home was slower. The weight of the town's stairs clung to her, even after the buildings had faded behind the pines. Lila chattered about the mare, swinging her arm in Takota's grip, and Eileen let the sound wash over her until the sharp edges of the morning dulled. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was streaked with the pale gold of late afternoon. Inside, Takota set the supplies down while Eileen shook the snow from her shawl. Lila knelt by the hearth, arranging the carved bird and a few pine cones in a neat row. Eileen found herself studying Takota's face as he worked. How his expression didn't change, yet never seemed distant. There was no judgment in him, no pressing for words she wasn't ready to give. After supper, when Lila was asleep, Eileen sat at the table mending a tear in her skirt. Takota was near the fire, working a new piece of wood with his knife. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic scrape and the occasional pop from the logs. "You didn't have to walk with us today," she said, her eyes still on the needle. "I did," he said simply. The firelight threw his shadow long against the wall. She thought of the way the town had looked at them, the way his presence had steadied her without asking anything in return. Outside, the wind began to stir again, brushing against the shutters like a hand testing the latch. Inside, the space between them felt less like a distance and more like a pause, something that might close if either of them moved. She didn't. And neither did he. But for the first time, she didn't feel she had to. The wind carried the scent of another storm days before the first flakes fell. The pines groaned under its warning, and the sky turned the color of tarnished silver. At the station, the notice was nailed to the wall. Supply trains delayed until weather clears. Eileen read it with a small knot of unease in her chest, the same feeling she'd had as a girl when the cellar door swelled shut in summer rains. Takota didn't linger by the notice. He bought salt, lamp oil, and a coil of rope without comment. Eileen followed him through the quiet street, Lila skipping between them, her mittened hands swinging theirs. The town seemed to watch their passing without watching, eyes glancing from windows and doorways, but no voices calling out. Back at the cabin, they worked without discussion. Dakota split wood until the ground around him was littered with neat stacks, his breath rising in steady clouds. Eileen mended worn seams in Lila's coat, her fingers stiff from the cold. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It felt instead like the pause between heartbeats. By the second day, the storm came in earnest. Snow swept sideways across the meadow, swallowing the trees one by one until only the closest trunks remained visible. The roof moaned under the weight. Inside, the fire burned bright, the walls breathing in and out with each gust. Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, her carved bird balanced in her palm. "Will you still be my pretend daddy tomorrow?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes fixed on Dakota. He didn't answer at once. He crouched to feed another log into the fire, his hair falling forward. When he straightened, his hand rested on her head, his thumb brushing once over her temple. "Tomorrow's close," he said, and the faintest warmth touched his voice. That night, Eileen found herself standing by the window, watching snow stream past the glass. She thought of the station platform the day they met, how he had simply taken her hand and turned away from the place where her life had been emptied. The gloves he'd given her still hung by the door, the seams now loose from wear. She had meant to return them, but the thought felt wrong, like returning a word once spoken. A deep crack above pulled her from her thoughts. Dakota was already at the door, boots half-laced. The roof sagged under a heavy drift. Without speaking, they climbed the ladder, the wind clawing at their faces. Snow stung her cheeks as she worked beside him, pushing the weight toward the edge. Her arms burned with the effort, but he matched her pace, neither rushing nor slowing for her. When the roof was clear, they climbed down, breathless and laughing despite the cold. It was the first time she'd heard his laughter, low, quiet, as if even joy was something to be measured. Inside, the warmth felt sharper for the work they'd done. Lila was asleep, curled under the quilt. Eileen poured water from the kettle, steam softening the air between them. "You didn't have to let me help," she said. "You live here," he replied simply. She held his gaze a moment longer than she meant to, the fire snapping in the silence. There was no promise in his words, no delineation, but something had shifted all the same. The storm raged through the night, and by morning the world outside was nothing but white upon white. Dakota checked the woodpile, then the door latch, moving with the same quiet certainty as always. Eileen felt the tightness in her chest loosen, not because the storm would end, but because she knew they could withstand it. By the third day, the snow had eased, but the cold deepened. A rider came through in the afternoon, his horse stamping in the drifts. Dakota met him at the door. The man's breath smoked in the air as he delivered the news. A man from Eileen's past was in town, asking questions. She knew who before the name was spoken. The taste of old shame rose in her mouth. Dakota's eyes flicked to her once, then back to the rider. "Tell him nothing," he said, his tone carrying no strain. When the rider left, the wind closed the silence around them. Eileen stood by the hearth, her hands twisting the hem of her skirt. "He'll come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Dakota crossed the room, stopping a pace from her. "Then we wait." There was no bravado in it, only a calm certainty that steadied her more than any oath could have. Outside, the snow began again, fine and unending. Inside, the fire burned, and the waiting began. The snow had begun again before dawn, falling in tight, silver flakes that clung to the eyelashes and made the air itself seem narrower. Eileen could feel the change in the wind, the way it pressed low against the eaves, as though the day itself leaned forward to listen. Lila slept curled in the quilt, one small hand wrapped around the carved bird as though it were a talisman. Dakota was already at the table, oiling the leather strap of his rifle. The fire cast a steady light over his shoulders, his movements slow, deliberate. By mid-morning, the quiet broke. The sound came from far down the path, hoofbeats, uneven, carrying too much weight for the snow's softness. Eileen's stomach tightened, the knowledge already there before she could name it. Dakota rose without haste, his eyes on the door, his body still. The knock, when it came, rattled the frame. She opened it because she could not bear to stand behind it. The man on the porch was as she remembered, broad in the shoulders, mouth curled in the smirk that always held more scorn than charm. His coat was dusted with snow, his boots crusted with ice. But his eyes were the same quick flick toward Lila, the same narrowing when they returned to her mother. "Eileen May," he drawled, as if the name belonged to him. "I hear you've been keeping interesting company." Before she could answer, Dakota stepped forward, the air shifting with his nearness. He didn't put himself between them, not quite, but his presence was a wall all the same. The man's smirk widened. And this would be him. "The talk in town doesn't do you justice, Greyhawk. You're bigger than they say." Dakota said nothing. The silence stretched until the man's grin thinned. "I came to take what's mine," he said finally, jerking his chin toward Eileen. "You've had your fun playing house, Eileen. Time to come back where you belong." "I don't belong to you," she said, the words steady despite the rush of her pulse. "You always did like to pretend you were better than the rest." His gaze slid toward the child again. "Or maybe this is about her. Pretty thing, but she needs a proper man to raise her, not—" He let the sentence hang, ugly in its absence. Eileen felt the heat rise in her face, but before she could speak, a small voice cut through the cold air. "He's my dad," Lila said from the doorway. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair tangled from sleep, but her eyes were clear and certain. "He's staying." The words fell into the space between the three of them, sharper than the wind. Dakota's gaze didn't move from the man on the porch, but something shifted in it, a faint narrowing, the quiet focus of a hunter who knows the moment before the strike. "You've come far enough," he said, his voice even. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the man's smirk faltered. His eyes flicked between them, searching for something that wasn't there, and in that absence, his bluster broke. "You'll regret this," he muttered, stepping back into the snow. The horse shifted under him as he swung into the saddle, the sound of hooves fading into the whiteness. The wind rushed in around them until Dakota shut the door. For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the fire's crackle. Eileen's hands were trembling, though she wasn't cold. Dakota's gaze found hers. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak, but there was something in his stillness that made her feel steadier than any touch could have. By afternoon, the snow had eased, leaving the air sharp and clear. Dakota saddled the horse without telling her why, but when she asked where they were going, his answer was simple. "The station." The road was half buried in drifts, the pines heavy with ice. Lila rode in front of him, her hands gripping the saddle horn, her laughter ringing out when the horse broke into a short trot. Eileen rode behind, her skirt hem brushing snow, the air bright in her lungs. The station looked smaller in winter, its roof bowed under snow. Steam from the waiting train curled into the sky, the smell of coal smoke drifting over the platform. A few townsfolk stood near the steps, their voices carrying in the still air. Among them was Mrs. Whitlow, her eyes narrowing as the three of them dismounted. Eileen felt the weight of the stairs, but something in her spine stayed straight. Dakota stepped up onto the platform, his hand out to steady Lila, then Eileen. They walked together toward the depot office, where a traveling preacher was warming his hands over the potbelly stove. The man looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes as Dakota spoke. "We need a wedding." Eileen's breath caught, but she didn't speak. The preacher glanced between them, then nodded, as though such requests were not the strangest thing to cross his path on the rails. "I'll need your names," he said, reaching for a small leather book. "Dakota Greyhawk. Eileen May Bennett." Her voice didn't shake, and the sound of it filled her chest like warm air. Mrs. Whitlow had drifted closer, her hands clasped, her mouth tight. Others had stopped to watch. No one spoke. The preacher led them to the small patch of platform, where the sunlight caught in the steam. The cold stung Eileen's cheeks, but her hands were warm where Dakota took them in his. His grip was steady, the roughness of his palms grounding her more than any words could. "Do you take this woman," the preacher began, "to be your wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Dakota said, the words deep and certain. The preacher turned to her. "Do you take this man to be your wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Eileen's gaze held his. She thought of the station platform where they'd first stood, of the snow filling their footprints, of the roof they'd cleared together, of Lila's laughter in the stable. "I do," she said. The preacher smiled faintly, then pronounced them husband and wife. Dakota didn't move at once, but when he did, it was only to lift her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. The train's whistle cut through the moment, loud and long, sending a plume of steam over them. Snow drifted down from the roof in a slow, heavy sheet, dusting Eileen's hair, clinging to Dakota's bare shoulders where his coat had slipped. Some in the crowd turned away. Others watched in silence. Mrs. Whitlow said nothing at all. Lila stepped between them, taking each of their hands in her small ones. "Now you can be my daddy forever," she said, her voice certain as the sky above them. They walked away from the platform together, the snow crunching under their boots, the sound of the train fading behind them. The cold bit at their faces, but the warmth between them was enough to carry through the wind. And if anyone in town spoke of it later, if the gossip curled through parlors and across store counters, it didn't reach them. Some stories were meant to live outside the noise, carried instead in the quiet between heartbeats, in the steady clasp of a hand, in the shared breath of those who had chosen to stay. Looking back now, I'll tell you this: sometimes family isn't born in blood or bound in years. Sometimes it's found in a moment on a station platform, in the snow, when someone takes your hand without asking where you've been. And if you ever find that kind of steadfast love, don't let the wind take it from you. Hold it close and walk home together.